made you choose Pyle as a subject? What led to your interest in him?
Well, I've had a fairly long connection with Ernie Pyle. If you're a journalism student at Indiana University, as I was from 1978 to 1982, you could not help but know at least a little bit about Ernie Pyle's career. I went to class, my journalism class, in Ernie Pyle Hall. That's also where I wrote on the student newspaper, the Indiana Daily Student, as Ernie did when he was a student at IU. And so if you went up to the second floor there, when Ernie Pyle Hall was still used for the journalism department, there was a lounge area. And years later, also, the lounge area was there. And it had a display of material and memorabilia from Ernie's life. I remember, I think there was a spade he used, a typewriter, and also the citation for the Pulitzer Prize that he won in 1944 for his war reporting. And it really wasn't until years later that I started reading more and more about him, read his columns when he was on the road, writing from various places across the United States. But I was always struck particularly by his war columns and the way he was able to get so close and make those kind of connections he did with the average soldier in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and then on in France, and finally in the Pacific. So Ernie was always a bit of a hero to me, but I only really appreciated his writing and the quality of his writing till afterwards, when I also tried to write on a daily basis as a working journalist in a small town newspaper in Rensselaer, Indiana. As Ernie did, he started out here in Indiana on a small town daily as well, up in LaPorte with the LaPorte Herald, then later on went to the Washington Daily News. But that daily grind of journalism was something that we both shared, and really something that we had in common. So I was always interested in Ernie's life, and very happy to do a youth bio on Ernie, part of our youth bio collection at the IHS Press, where we kind of spotlight notable Hoosiers through these books.
Great. And I know you said you connected with Ernie, you know, kind of through your pursuit of journalism. But when I was looking at the sources you sent me on Ernie, what I thought, you know, myself connected to, and what a lot of our guests might, is kind of his small town Indiana roots, which, you know, people can relate to all over Indiana. So could you just kind of highlight his experiences in Dana, Indiana, and how that shaped him?
Sure. Of course, Ernie was born on August 3rd, 1900 in the small town of Dana. If you don't know where Dana is, it's north of Terre Haute, not too far away from the Illinois border. It's a very small town. It's kind of those one stoplight towns that you might know, where you kind of drive through and sometimes don't even barely recognize as you drive through town. But Ernie grew up there on a farm. He was the only child of Will and Maria Pyle. Will Pyle was a very shy man, kept himself to himself. He didn't have a lot of heart-to-heart talks with Ernie growing up, but Ernie always felt very close to his father, always considered him, their relationship to be fairly good. Maria was quite unlike Will. She was more outgoing, was happy to tell you her opinion on a subject, even if you didn't want to hear it. She'd be happy to tell you anyway. More outgoing of his mother and between his two parents. But Ernie didn't really like the farm life. He had a kind of a vagabond personality. He wanted to be out doing things, getting on the road, experiencing new things. Love if there's a circus nearby, you go out and see, you know, see what kind of acts they have. Always loved going to Indianapolis, going to the Indianapolis 500 race. He once said that he'd rather win the Indianapolis 500 and be president of the United States. Really idolized the race car drivers that ran every May the 500-mile race. And so he didn't really like farm life and the drudgery of farm life, and looked far afield, tried to, escape his small town roots, and he found a way to do that through journalism, and discovered that when he went to Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana.
Very relatable story he's got there. Something that, a lot of people from Indiana can relate to, growing up in small towns, kind of moving towards the city. I'm sure we've got plenty of IU alumni in here. They're all over the state.
That's right.
But you said the journalism building at IU was named after Ernie Pyle, right?
It was, yes. It's no longer the School of Journalism. They moved on. It's now the Visitor Center at IU, but still named for Ernie. There is a statue of Ernie outside of Franklin Hall, where the media school is now. So Ernie's memory is still kept alive at Indiana University in Bloomington. But Indiana was very important, and I think it shaped Ernie in a lot of ways. I think it gave him a lot of self-confidence. It gave him a friend that he kept for the rest of his life, a young man named Paige Kavanaugh, who was a World War I veteran and who Ernie wrote letters to during his war years and was very close to throughout his life. And there's a funny story that is told about why Ernie decided to concentrate in journalism. There wasn't a journalism major at IU at that time, so his official major was economics, but he made friends with another gentleman named Clarence Edmondson, who was the dean of men at IU. And Clarence Edmondson told the story that Ernie came to him. He realized that he might want to be a journalist one day, and so encouraged him to take as many journalism classes as he could. But Paige Kavanaugh said they gravitated to journalism classes because they were the easiest classes on campus. Now, that changed when I went to IU, I can tell you that. But that's a funny story about Ernie's time at IU. He worked on Indiana Daily Student, served as an editor, and actually left IU before officially graduating. IU's journalism department got a message from the LaPorte newspaper, LaPorte Herald, that they were looking for a young reporter, and someone at the journalism department recommended Ernie for the job, and he left before graduating. That was a big disappointment to his parents, who really wanted him to get that college degree. But back then, you didn't really need a college degree to become a reporter as you do today.
Mm-hmm.
If you showed some kind of a talent, you could be snatched up by a small town newspaper like LaPorte.
So he clearly had the talent, but can you explain for us who aren't as familiar with his writing or with journalism, what made Ernie Pyle such a good journalist?
I think his ability to connect with people was a big thing. Also, he kept his style sparse and simple and direct as well. Later on in his career, he served a brief time, a couple years, as managing editor of the Washington Daily News. And he gave some good advice to his reporters that I think writers could use today. He try to find that quote. Yeah, here it is. Write a story as though it were a privilege for you to write it. Put some sauciness and sparkle into it. You don't have to be smart alecky or pseudo-funny. Be human. Try to write like people talk. And that's what he did, I think, for his columns during World War II. He saw himself as more of a letter writer. He was writing to the folks back home, letting them know what was happening and what their loved ones were experiencing in combat. Their sons, their brothers, their fathers, their husbands. Making those kinds of connections to describe an often indescribable situation, actually being in combat. And, because of censorship, and the like. That was hard to do, but I think Ernie did it as well as anyone did in writing about World War II.
And you meant just, talk about his time, writing in World War II. How did he get involved with writing, in association with the war and the armed forces?
Well, he was, a famous, one of the things that really struck me when I was doing my book on Ernie was the fact that he was fairly well known even before his wartime exploits, before he became a wartime columnist and covered the fighting overseas. Through his time as the Hoosier vagabond, writing, traveling around the country, writing columns 6 days a week, really writing about kind of on the road before there was an on the road with Charles Corral. There was Ernie Pyle, he said, my home is America. And it really was. He traveled around the country, talking to interesting people, writing about interesting experiences he had, making fun of himself, being a journalist on the road. And it was really eye-opening when I went to the Ernie Pyle home in Dana and to do my research for the book. They had letters from the various Scripps Howard newspapers that were running Ernie's column. It started out about 24 newspapers and it grew later on, of course. But these letters are full of praise for Ernie and his writing ability, saying how popular his column was with their subscribers. And if they ever stopped running his column in their newspaper, they lose subscribers hand over fist. So even before the war, Ernie had a way to captivate people through the words he put on paper. And that's something he just he elevated through his wartime experiences. And, Ernie had seen some of war as part of his job as that traveling correspondent. He did go overseas to England to report on the war before the United States entered. So he was there for the great German bombing raids, the Blitz, to try to bomb England out of the war. So he had that experience in hand before America got involved in the conflict. And he became one of the 1,600 accredited war correspondents to report on the war. And I think it's important for people to realize that there were a variety of ways that people got news about the war. There are civilian correspondents overseas, who are accredited by the War Department for various news services. They could be major newspapers like the Chicago Tribune, the New York Times, could be news services like Associated Press, United Press, the International News Service, could be columnists. Even Ernest Hemingway went to war and wrote about his experiences for Collier's magazine. And these are civilians. They're subject to military authority. They're subject to censorship. But for that, they're given food and shelter by the military, and they're able to go up and talk to soldiers as far as up to the front lines as they could manage even. Ernie was not one of what I call one of those communique commandos who stayed behind the lines safe at headquarters and just used the official communiques issued by military PR people to talk about and write about the progress of the war. He went up front and talked to the actual soldiers doing the fighting to get their perspective on things. He was one of the ones who risked their lives at the front lines. People like Don Whitehead, there's Ernie, there's Clark Lee, Richard Tregaskis, Robert Sherrod, and many others, Martha Gellhorn later in the war. You could tell that they would have some kind of authority because you could look at their date lines and tell, they're not from behind the lines, but they're near where the fighting is actually going on. So I think that's what gave Ernie his authority, not only with the folks back home, but also with those who are doing the fighting on the front lines. They saw him at the front, sleeping where they slept, eating what they ate, which was not always very appetizing, with sea rations and the like. And I think that's what really made him so special to the soldiers on the front line.
So that kind of action, that closeness to the front line, that wasn't normal for a typical war correspondent?
The good ones, it was typical.
Okay.
There were some who decided, I'd rather just get, be safe behind the lines and get my news from the PR mouthpieces from the military. But the better ones, risked their safety and went to, as near to the front lines as they could to get their story. And some lost their lives, as Ernie did. There's also a gentleman named John Buscemi from Indiana, who was a photographer from the Gary Post-Tribune, who worked for Yank magazine, which was a military organ sponsored by the U.S. Military, who lost his lives overseas getting his photos near the front lines. So it was a dangerous occupation, and people were wounded and often killed as well.
And I'm kind of jumping ahead with that. I know that, he ultimately does end up passing in the Pacific Theater. What led him from, the front lines there in Britain to the Pacific Theater with the American troops?
Well, Ernie had seen a lot of action. He started out in North Africa for Operation Torch, went on to cover the invasion of Sicily, came back for arrest. One of the things, if you were a civilian correspondent, a big difference between you and someone who was serving in the military, if you had enough and wanted to go home, you could go home, unlike the average soldier who was there until he got injured or killed or invalided home. But Ernie came back home for arrest after Sicily, returned for the landings in France for the Normandy operation on D-Day, was there for the breakout from Normandy and the capture and liberation of Paris. Was in Paris for the liberation, and once again decided he had enough and returned to the U.S. And after that, he's won the Pulitzer Prize for his columns. He could have stayed home. He thought he had used up a number of his chances already on the battlefield. He had a couple of close shaves, particularly in Italy, where a shell hit a house he was staying in, and he barely escaped with only minor injuries. But he was under a lot of pressure to go to the Pacific and write about the sailors, the Marines, the airmen who were fighting against the Japanese. And Ernie felt some kind of an obligation to the people in the Pacific to report on what was going on over there. He said, he hated to go, but he felt he had to go. And he went and covered the last great operation of the war, the invasion of Okinawa. And there's an interesting conversation he had with another correspondent, Robert Sherrod, after the initial landings went off with very slight opposition, which was a big relief to Ernie and the other correspondents and a lot of the Marines as well. But they're back on this ship, a transport ship off seas, writing their stories about the invasion. And they're talking about what's going on. And Sherrod said he's going to go home. He's had enough of the fighting. He's been over in the Pacific for years now. And Ernie said, yeah, he too was just going to stay for a couple more days and go home. But he was convinced to go on one final operation. There's a small island called Ishima off the west coast of Okinawa. The resistance on Okinawa was toughening. Military authorities wanted to capture some airfields that were on Ishima they could use to help with the operations on Okinawa. And Ernie went there with the 77th Infantry Division and was scouting ahead with some officers and enlisted men for a location for a new command post when they were fired upon by a Japanese soldier. They scrambled off the vehicles, took cover in the ditches on the side of the road. The firing had slackened. Ernie had poked up his head to ask if everyone was okay, and that's when he was hit in the head and killed instantly. But Ernie felt an obligation, I think, to the soldiers who were fighting in the Pacific to tell their story as well. And he had some kind of a premonition that he might not get back to the United States, and it proved to be correct.
We've probably got about 7 more minutes before we open up to questions from the audience. But just kind of leaving it there, I think this is something that you can, speak about more with your journalistic experience than, I could. What is his legacy? What legacy did Ernie Pyle leave in journalism, and then just beyond that as well?
I think it's a legacy to tell the common soldier's story, to be able to get up there and let people know as best he could what was, going on with combat, how it was changing the folks they had known before, the loved ones they had sent overseas to fight, and how that experience is just a life-altering one. And for some, they would never be the same again. And Ernie, if you were a soldier during World War II, you were just one of millions, and your individuality was sometimes lost, and you just became a number. You're known by your dog tag serial number sometimes more than your name. But Ernie put a human face on the war. He always made sure to include a individual's hometown when he wrote about them, sometimes to talk about what they did during their civilian days, and tried to put a human face on the war, saying, here are the people who are actually doing the fighting and the dying, so you can maintain your life back in the United States safe and sound. And it really was something, a badge of honor, if you had your name in one of Ernie's columns, if you were a common soldier. There's this very funny cartoon from Yank magazine, which is produced by and for enlisted men in the service. And it's a cartoon showing two soldiers talking, and in the background you can see a third, and he's got his hand over his arms, and there's a clipping kind of falling out from an envelope, and it looks like he's crying. And there's a captain that said, Ernie Pyle misspelled his name. So you can tell how important it was to get your name in one of Ernie's columns. And, some soldiers said sometimes they'd rather have their name in one of Ernie's columns than even win a medal for valor on the field of combat.
Do you see a trend, how you said he personalized it, he put a human face to it. Do you see that continuing into, following wars with other war correspondents, or was he kind of really one of a kind?
I think he set the standard, and there were a lot of Ernie Pyle impersonators after World War II, where that kind of became the standard way that you report, particularly in the Korean War that came afterward. You can see a lot of dispatches from the front, giving people's old hometowns and trying to personalize it. So he really set the stage, I think, for war reporting to come. It's a kind of a something that might have been lost to today's reporters, but for a long period of time, he had a large impact on how wars were reported. And sometimes it got too much for people. They would complain. I know that in doing my book on Tregaskis, there's a review of one of his books that he wrote where he followed in Ernie's footsteps, and he tried to put people's hometowns. Whenever he mentioned a name, he'd always have a hometown. And some reviewers said this got too much for him. He just couldn't take it anymore. It was just too often that reporters did this. And so it's kind of the Ernie Pyle effect of war reporting.
And then one last question I have for you before we kind of open up to the audience is just, I know you've spent a lot of time looking at his articles and his writings. Is there one that stands out to you as a favorite, or even, a quote or a story of his that just kind of really resonates?
Well, I did pick one. It's one that was never actually published. And someone found it in his pocket after his death. It was a column he was going to post after the war in Europe had ended. The war in Europe ended in May 1945, and the war in the Pacific would not end until August 1945. And it's very effective about what the war did to Ernie and a lot of other people, both reporting it and experiencing it as combat soldiers. He wrote this. Last summer, I wrote that I hoped the end of the war could be a gigantic relief, but not an elation. In the joyousness of high spirits, it is easy for us to forget the dead. Those who have gone would not wish themselves to be a millstone of gloom around our necks. But there are many of the living who have had burned into their brains forever the unnatural sight of cold dead men scattered over the hillsides and in the ditches along the high roads of hedge throughout the world, dead men by mass production in one country after another, month after month and year after year. Dead men in winter and dead men in summer. Dead men in such familiar promiscuity that they become monotonous. Dead men in such monstrous infinity that you come almost to hate them. These are the things that you at home need not even try to understand. You at home, they are columns of figures, or he is a near one who went away and just didn't come back. You didn't see him lying so grotesque and hasty beside the gravel road in France. We saw him by the multiple thousands, and that's the difference. I think it's very effective writing about the cost of war, not only in men, but also on the psyche of someone who saw it firsthand.
Yeah, that's really a great quote, and you can only imagine what he saw in his experience. So now we're going to open it up to questions from the audience because we're really thankful that you all have joined us. I'm seeing looks like Mr. Owen Johnson. I think that's your last name. It cuts off, but looks like you've got a question. Looks like you're still on mute right now.
Owen can answer all these questions himself. Owen's an Ernie Pyle scholar as well.
Okay, thank you. I do want to plug three things. One, there is a Facebook site called, or Facebook group called Friends of Ernie Pyle. And those of you who want to find out more on a regular basis just can go on Facebook and ask to be admitted.
It's a great group. Yeah.
Secondly, starting this Saturday on WFIU2 and available on WFIU's website is the beginning of a 13-part series called the Ernie Pyle Experiment, which imagines the relationship between Ernie Pyle and his wife and focuses in each episode on one column that he wrote. And third thing, kind of self-promotion, I published a book 4 years ago with the IU Press called At Home with Ernie Pyle, which includes everything he wrote about Indiana and its people. It's unfortunately out of print from the IU Press, but you can buy it still on Amazon. I have two questions for you, Ray.
Okay.
I'm asking you to use your imagination. One, what do you think Ernie Pyle's life would have been like if he had survived World War II? And two, if you could ask Ernie Pyle one question, what would it be?
Okay. I've often thought about what would have happened to Ernie if he'd survived his time in the Pacific. He just left, a day or two earlier and went back to the United States. And I've often wondered if he would have ended up somehow in Hollywood. It's one of the things that Richard Tergassis did. He went to Hollywood after the war and wrote screenplays and screenwriter for a variety of Hollywood films. Or he might, Ernie was such a good writer, after the war in the 50s, it was the period of real boom in magazine journalism. And I wonder if Ernie might have ended up on the staff of a magazine like Saturday Evening Post or Life magazine or something like Collier's before it went belly up. And the one thing I'd ask Ernie is, how were you able to remember all that detail you put in your columns without taking notes at the time? As someone who can barely remember what happened yesterday, I'm just always amazed that Ernie, when he went to the front, didn't take notes for the most part, that he thought that having a reporter on the front with a notebook and a long pencil would be intimidating to the average GI. But he must have had a great memory because he's able then, after going up to the front, spending time with various units, and go back behind the lines to write his columns, produce such vivid writing and remembering all the details, all the names, all the stories he told in his columns. I've always been amazed by that.
Thank you.
And that actually covers the next question we had in our chat, was if he, really took notes during his interviews or if it was mostly memory. So
a lot of memory, yeah. He took some notes, but not a lot of notes. He's had a very good memory. And he was able, he didn't have to write about the big picture, like a lot of reporters who were dealing with a daily deadline. He was, a columnist, so he could take a look at, things that little details and stories that the big city newspapermen or the wire service reporters like AP, UP, International News Service would not be able to cover because they were stuck with, dealing with the day-to-day movement of the various armies from one spot to another.
One of the next questions we have in the chat is just asking did he maintain any correspondence with people outside of his family, like fans, or was he just mostly responding to family letters and things like that?
When I wrote my book, there were a lot of letters, of course, to his wife back home. They had a troubled marriage over the years. They were in divorce at one point before Ernie went off to report on World War II. He made arrangements before he left that they could be remarried if by possible by proxy, and that's what happened. So they did remarry. But he also wrote, to Paige Kavanaugh. Another individual who I haven't mentioned is very important in Ernie's story is his kind of personal editor, Lee Miller, at the Scripps Howard newspaper syndicate. He was a very close friend, handled all of Ernie's columns, was very close to him. And there's a funny story that before the D-Day operation, Lee Miller said he was going to kind of nominate some of Ernie's columns about the war for the Pulitzer Prize that year. And Ernie said, "Oh, my kind of writing is not going to win, an award like that." And Lee Miller bet him $100 that he'd actually win. And Ernie was so pessimistic that he actually took the bet. And when he heard that he'd won the 1944 Pulitzer for his writing, he said it was the best bet he'd ever lost in his life. He was happy to lose that. Owen, is there anyone else that you remember him writing during the war?
He wrote actually to quite a few people. I have photocopies of about 1,300 of his letters, and some of them are odds and ends that I found on eBay. I didn't buy, but I just copied them because the copyright belongs to the Pyle family, which has given me permission to use them. He wrote to reviewers. It's a little awkward to raise this issue, but he had affairs of some kind with two different women, and one of them Jim Tobin writes about in his 1997 biography because he had been able to get in touch with that family. I have about 30 letters that Pyle wrote to a woman from Nashville, Indiana, with whom he had some kind of relationship. Exactly how what happened, I'm not fully certain. But what I find interesting in the letters is each person he wrote to, he wrote in a different way. When he wrote to his parents, he was the dutiful son, talking about what he had accomplished. With Paige Kavanaugh, he let loose.
Yeah, those are some X-rated letters sometimes. With Paige.
Yeah, that's right. And with his wife, he, in spite of his having those affairs, he remained true to her and supported her, couldn't understand the nature of her mental illness, although he tried. And he wrote some letters to C. Edmondson that Ray mentioned, where he talks about his developing career in LaPorte, Indiana. So altogether, they give a much more rounded picture of Pyle than we normally get.
What do you think would have happened to Ernie after the war? What do you think he would have done, Owen?
Well, one of the big difficulties is I would classify him as a moderate in politics. And he was friends with people in the Roosevelt administration. As you know, he of course visited Eleanor Roosevelt. He took his wife's niece and nephew once to a Roosevelt press conference. I think it was 1934. And anyway, I think he might have been vulnerable to some attacks in the McCarthy era. I think you may have hit it on the head with the idea that he might have written for magazines. One of his dreams was getting something in the New Yorker. He never got around to it, but he clearly read it regularly because in some of his letters or columns, and the total number of columns I'm thinking is about 3,700, because you haven't talked at all about his aviation.
That's right.
Period from 1928 to 32, when he was writing 6 columns a week every day and knew everybody in aviation. So I think the advantage of writing magazine articles is he wouldn't have to travel. And by the end of the war, he was so well known, he hated all the accoutrements of fame, except that it gave him entree to get certain things done or to make contact with certain people.
Right. Yeah, he joked that, fame really didn't go to his head because it came so late in his life. He was in his 40s, and he said there were only a few things that he found great about. He hated being recognized when he went out to restaurants and all that, but he said it was great because if he came and wanted certain items, clerks would recognize him and might give him certain hard to find items. And if he had plumbing problems or if his typewriter broke down, if they heard it was for Ernie Pyle, they'd come right away, and he could, get seats on planes or trains when others not quite as well known might not have. So those were the perks of fame for Ernie Pyle.
Looks like we've got a question. Pardon me if I butcher the last name, but Joe Zarko. You're on mute right now, so let's get you unmuted and we'll take your question. All righty, Joe, you're unmuted. Go ahead and ask your question.
Of Hollywood, I can't think of Ernie Pyle without thinking of Hoagie Carmichael. Of course, they both went to IU.
Right. And
also his love of racing. Would he have known Eddie Rickenbacker, even though he's quite a bit younger than Rickenbacker?
I think he would have because of his experience as the aviation columnist. He was well known in aviation circles before he was the Vagabond correspondent. He kind of made that position for himself. He was really the first aviation columnist in the United States during the golden age of aviation. He knew all the big figures in the new FAA in Washington, D.C., pilots, airline stewardesses, people like Amelia Earhart. There's a famous story, an anecdote, where someone tried to introduce Amelia to Ernie. Said, "Oh, I know who Ernie is." To admit that you don't know Ernie is to admit that you're nothing in aviation. So it was very well known. And I think that really you could do a good book about Ernie before World War II, just dealing with his aviation days and his days on the road as the Hoosier Vagabond.
That's actually my goal, to be honest.
Any interest in racing cars?
Pardon?
You think he had any interest in racing cars himself?
Oh, definitely, definitely. He wrote, I think, 3 columns in 1937 when he was in Indianapolis about the 500. And as near as I can figure out, he went the first time when he was about 14. Yeah. And he went every year after that until he left Indiana to go to Washington, D.C.
I meant as a driver.
Oh, he would have
Oh,
loved to. I mean, he was interested in, he got his first car when he was 14, and he loved to tinker with the engines. You know, and you're right, the aviation fits together with that. We're talking about motors and speed and all of that kind of thing. So he would have loved to have driven. So instead of having Dave Letterman driving cars, we could have had Ernie Pyle doing it.
What about a
there's a,
motorcycle?
there's a funny story from the war too that, you know, Ernie and cars seem to go together even during wartime. And a tank unit had captured a German vehicle, kind of a early Volkswagen, and given it to Ernie in thanks for mentioning them in a column. And eventually had to give it away to military authorities, but he said it was okay because he preferred the ride of the American Jeep anyway. But cars and Ernie seem to go together even in the war.
Yeah, Hoagie and Pyle were friends. Pyle in 1922, when he was football manager at IU, wanted to make sure that the IU band, what we now call the Marching Hundred, it wasn't called that then, could go to every football game. And so he set about fundraising. And on one occasion, they had a dance, and he persuaded Hoagie and his band to be one of the two bands that were playing. The idea being that there would always be one band or the other playing. There wouldn't be an intermission, so students could enjoy it more. And he did a 2-column series on Hoagie when he was in visiting him in New York.
Thank you.
We've got 2 questions in the chat I want to cover before our hour runs out. And then after those 2 questions, if we've got time, we'll see if we've got any others. But could you just quickly highlight the papers he wrote for, you know, throughout his career?
Sure. Well, he wrote, of course, for the Indiana Daily Student. His first job after leaving IU was at the LaPorte Herald. He was there only a brief time, a few months, when he got a job at the Washington Daily News, which was part of the Scripps Howard newspaper chain. When he married Jerry, his wife, Jerry Siebold, who he met in Washington, D.C., in June 1926, he convinced her that they should take their life savings, pull it, and hit the road and see America before it was too late. So they went on a kind of around the country driving tour, sleeping outside and camping out. And when they returned, he did work on a couple of New York newspapers very briefly. But then his friend Lee Miller convinced him to come back to the Washington Daily News. And that's when he became the aviation columnist. He was managed editor for a time, became the Hoosier Vagabond, and then went off to fame in World War II, writing for the Scripps Howard newspaper chain.
And then our second question in the chat was just if Ernie had ever lived in Indiana in Indianapolis throughout his time here in Indiana.
I don't believe he ever did live in it. He visited here, of course, but he never lived in Indianapolis. You know, grew up in Dana, went to Bloomington, IU, LaPorte, Washington, New York, but I don't think he ever lived in Indianapolis.
When he was in Indianapolis, he always stayed at what was called the Hotel Warren, which is very near the Colts football stadium. It has a different name now, and I can't remember precisely what it is.
So that kind of wraps up our our question time, because we want to make sure we keep this to an hour. Before we go, I do want to give a shout out. We've got a young man joining us named Jonah, who just did a National History Day project on Ernie Pyle, and he just submitted a video for the state competition as well. So
Great.
You know, this subject is something that is, still being noticed today. People are still taking note of Ernie Pyle and his accomplishments and the effect that he had.
I also want to give a shout out to the Ernie Pyle World War II Museum in Dana, Indiana. It used to be, of course, the Ernie Pyle State Historic Site, but it fell victim to some budget cuts. The local people, got together with some also reporters from Indiana to save the home from closure. Of course, now it's not open, but when it does reopen, I encourage you, if you have the opportunity, go to Dana and visit the home and learn more about Ernie and his life and his contributions to our state and our country.
Yeah, in fact, we were scheduled to have, I'm on the board of directors of the museum, and we were scheduled to have a commemorative um, occasion this Saturday on the 75th anniversary of Pyle's death. It's obviously been postponed. It will either be held August 8th during Ernie Pyle Days in Dana, or perhaps next year, depending on when things open up.
So I'm going to jump in. Sorry, I'm going to jump
turn it over to you
to say thank you all so much for coming, and a huge thanks to Ray and Kyle for making this happen. Just a few last things. As I mentioned at the beginning, if you enjoyed this program, please consider coming back next week. You'll find more information shortly in the next, I hope, 24 to 48 hours about next week's History Happy Hour with Jordan Ryan. About Indianapolis history through maps. That'll be same time, new Zoom link, and we've got some other exciting options coming soon. I put Ray's book in the chat through Amazon. Our Bastille Market is closed right now due to COVID, but you can still order his book through there, and we'll get it to you as quick as we can through the mail. We really appreciate you guys supporting IHS and what we do. If you missed your chance to donate and support our mission, there's a link right in the chat that can help you do that. And we hope to be getting this conversation up on YouTube soon. So keep an eye out for that, and on our website through the virtual resources for this and more to come shortly. So thank you all so much for coming. We really appreciate it, and have a great evening.
Yeah, thank you all.